Hi, welcome to this rather important vlog session from Erasmus House Publishing. The Bible has a lot to say about towers, mountains, and indeed high places of all kinds. With this in mind, we might ask ourselves how this speaks into the subject of our own cathedrals, skyscrapers, the twin towers of 9/11, and indeed the tragic recent fire at Notre Dame Cathedral. The best place to start is, interestingly enough, the book of Genesis, chapter 11. This is, of course, the story of the Tower of Babel, of a grand city and its tower that a united mankind set up in celebration of its own unity and prowess. But this city and its tower were established not in the name of good, but of evil. Indeed, the wickedness of the city is an old story, one that, in a sense, has repeated itself many times and in various ways down through the ages. History repeats itself, and so spiritual history repeats itself. To find the reason for modern disasters, divine judgments in the modern world and in history, we go to the source. We turn to the example of Scripture. So what precisely were the inhabitants of the mighty city of Babel doing that was so bad? Here, according to Genesis 11, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth.'" A tower that reached heaven, what could this mean? I have a lot to say about Babel in my 2016 book, Unlocking the Secrets of Genesis 1 Beginnings. As I lay out in chapters 26 to 28, the Tower of Babel was none other than what is commonly termed a ziggurat. What is a ziggurat? A sort of pyramid with four sides that became common in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC. Now, where it gets interesting is when we take a look at ancient Mesopotamian documents that give us clues as to what this ziggurat was all about. The old Mesopotamians, Mesopotamia, by the way, corresponds roughly with modern Iraq, gave the ziggurats names. Of one such ziggurat, called Esagila, for example, it was said, "They raised the head of Esagila toward heaven." Another famed ziggurat, Etemenanki, was said, quote, "to rival the heavens." If this sounds familiar, it should. As we have just read, according to Genesis 11:4, the Babelites wished to build, quote, "a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that they might make a name for themselves." So the Babelites and the ancient Mesopotamians, who were quite possibly the same thing, have this in common. First, they build great structures that reach high up into the sky, and second, such structures called ziggurats were built for their own glory, to the glory of man and humanism. Okay, let's look a bit more deeply now at the phrase, "a tower that reaches the heavens." The civilization described in Genesis chapter 11 was one that was on a technological roll. They had just developed a new technology, that of erecting great structures using baked brick, and could now erect a building far higher and stronger than they ever could before. As we know from history and the human condition, when man moves forward in terms of technology, industry, and invention, he tends to leave God behind. He tends to forget about God. When this happens, humanity moves deeper and deeper into sin and degradation. One could almost say that the more physically advanced man gets, the less spiritual he gets, or else perhaps that the more he increases in knowledge, so does he decrease in terms of wisdom. Now that phrase, "reaches the heavens," can be interpreted in both a spiritual and a physical way. On one level, we know that at the top of the ziggurat sat a temple, this for the purpose of communing with the gods, as a sort of meeting place between heaven and earth. In other words, yes, the Mesopotamian ziggurats were very pagan. There was a sense of reaching into the spiritual heavens. On another level, however, there is a sense in which these great buildings with their tops that reached heaven are making a very humanist statement, a statement that challenges God and deifies the human self. We start to get this idea when we look at other texts. The book of Isaiah tells a bit more about this, telling about the later city of Babylon, which is the spiritual successor to Babel, the prophet records the attitude of the Babylonians who regard their city of Babylon as, quote, the jewel of the kingdoms, the glory of the Babylonians' pride. According to Isaiah 47 verse 8, the Babylonians even utter a blasphemy, boasting, I am and there is none beside me. In other words, her pride had gone to her head, and she now supposed herself to be God. For instance, an ancient pagan hymn runs, quote, on the radiant dais he raised heaven high the firmly founded throne. He exalted there the power of my kingship. I bent low all the lands, made secure the people, the four corners of the universe. The people in unison call my name. Isaiah chapter 14 verse 13 goes further, condemning Babylon for desiring to ascend to the realm of God. Quote, you said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. Babylon inherited the spirit of Babel. She created her city and her wealth around her, vaunting it up to the heavens as an act of defiance, proclaiming her own greatness and proclaiming herself as a god. The ziggurat, the human-made temple, became a sort of monument to the eye, to humanity and humanism, to a humanity that had forgotten the true God and almost seemed, whether deliberately or unconsciously, to be challenging God, almost as if to say, here, I have penetrated the heavens, the realm of God, and I may claim to self-deification. So the cities with their tops to the heavens made not only a physical statement about pride and prowess, but went further, almost as if to challenge God in his heaven. With that, we might ask ourselves to what degree our modern secular cities might be making a similar statement, whether intentionally or not, proclaiming a humanism that has become an idol that has replaced God. But we'll get to this a bit later. The more man achieves progress, the more he reckons he can do it on his own, and the more he enjoys himself in that progress, and the more he forgets God. And yes, it's an old story. As late as the book of Revelation, at the end of the Bible, Babylon is again mentioned, except this time we find that same spirit thousands of years later manifesting probably through the Roman Empire, symbolically called Babylon in Revelation. We find here that she has again reared herself as high as humanly possible, has again forgotten God in her own pride and self-involvement. We know from the book of Genesis that Babel was brought low and reduced to rubble for its pride. As far as the later Babylon was concerned, we know from both history and scripture that she was later invaded by the Medo-Persians and brought low. Today little exists of the once proud city. In Revelation 19, we read further that Babylon, probably Rome, is brought low because of its pride. And so we can see from all three of these examples that, according to Scripture, whenever a nation exalts itself against God, whenever it becomes too proud, it incurs divine judgment. But these and such judgments are speaking of the world, the secular city as it were, and of what happens to a recalcitrant world that grows too sinful. What we do need to note, however, is that there is a further aspect to this question of judgment and the city. In fact, judgment is also leveled at the people of God, if they sin. In the Old Testament, this would have been Israel. In the New Testament and today, this would be the Church, Christianity. In the 6th century BC, the Israelites thought they were safe because God would never allow his temple to be destroyed, in their theology. Certainly, the world has its buildings, its great structures erected to its God, whether an idol or the human self. But the people of God also have theirs, erected to the true God. In the Old Testament, this was the temple in Jerusalem. But by the 6th century BC, the love of Israel for their God had waned. They had rejected God and worshipped idols. Many of these idols they had set up in the temple. They were also oblivious to the fact that God was angry with them for embracing these idols. They felt that God was in fact happy with them, and they had priests and prophets who told them that everything was okay and that there was no judgment coming. This despite the fact that the nation was falling apart around them and that there were many minor signs of judgment, such as burned and pillaged cities, attacks by neighboring peoples, and so forth, that had already occurred. Jeremiah complains about these false priests and prophets that, quote, "They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace." The people themselves were also complicit. According to Jeremiah again, the prophets prophesy lies. The priests rule by their own authority, and my people love it this way. Israel's leaders had even developed a theology that God would never destroy his temple, and that they were safe because God would never let his temple be annihilated by the Babylonians. The trouble was, the prophet and people alike were looking at the building and not at God. They had forgotten God a long time before and were steeped in idolatry. In their eyes, all they could see was the pomp, the ceremony kept up by the priests, and the magnificent Temple of Solomon, a building originally erected to honor God. The problem was, they were looking at the outside, while things on the inside had turned to rot long before. In the year 586 BC, God allowed the temple in its glory to be destroyed by the Babylonians. Why? Because God looks on the inside. If the building is rotting spiritually and visibly on the inside, then he will not allow the physical building to stand. The temple was duly destroyed, only to be rebuilt in 515 BC. A half millennium later, something similar occurred. In about 30 AD, the disciples were marveling at the great stones of which the temple in Jerusalem were made. Looking on the outside, as it were, they were saying, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." Like so many down through the ages, they marvel at the city, the magnificence, the outer skein, as it were, of the city. Jesus' reply to them must have shocked them. He said, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." So what's the dynamic that's being played out here? Again, the disciples are looking with physical eyes on the outside. The magnificent sheen of stone of the new temple Herod had erected, even more magnificent than that of Solomon. Again, as had been the case in the 6th century BC, Israel had sinned. What Jesus is prophesying is the judgment that was to fall some 40 years later in 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. Once again, although the great building itself was standing, the spiritual fire of the people of Israel, the people identified with the temple, was dim, and sin abounded. When that happens, the physical building will be judged and destroyed. And so we find that, in fact, there are two buildings: the holy building of God on the one hand, and the worldly building erected to some idol or else to the glory of man on the other. One could perhaps even call these respective structures, as Augustine might have, the city of God and the city of the world.